So I'll be talking about the coordinated inter-role communication protocol called CIRC that we just put a little short paper out on. Or in other words, this is how to synchronously compose while horizontally scale. Yeah. All right. So Web3 is all about composability, in my view. Of course, it's about more than that. I would say it's about two things, right? It's about censorship resistance and property rights or ownership and take your money away. You have custody of it yourself. But the other thing that it is about is composability. In Web 2, traditional web apps are independently operated. You need to trust the operator, and they communicate and interact asynchronously, and generally you have to have a business relationship between applications in order for them to interact with each other. Whereas on systems like Ethereum, you can have applications that are developed completely independently. The people who develop them, they don't know each other, they don't coordinate at all, and then they can act as building blocks on top of which you can build other applications, and users can create transactions that interact with multiple applications at once. I think this is one of the things that's enabled by building a universal virtual machine or world computer that everyone in the world can trust and operate on. And now you have applications that have shared memory, shared state. I like to give the example of Flash, which is something that you literally just couldn't do before in the world of Web 2 applications. Not to say that this is the be-all and end-all of Web 3. It allows you to do one particular type of thing, and it's useful to one particular type of party, namely arbitrage traders, but it really illustrates how powerful composability is. The fact that you can have a single transaction that interacts with a lending application and multiple exchanges that were not even specifically designed to work together, but just because they're all deployed in Ethereum, you can have a single transaction that borrows money, trades in a bunch of exchanges, and returns the money in one single transaction. Right, that's pretty crazy. Now, in the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen a multi-chain world explode on top of Ethereum, and this multi-chain world was born out of the need to scale. Right? Now, Rollups horizontally scale Ethereum. What does that really mean? Well, they shard computation across many different applications that are processed independently. They allow powerful servers to also help weaker nodes, the validators of Ethereum, verify state. It also allows for virtual machine diversity. One of the consequences, however, of splitting applications across many different parallel virtual machines is that it becomes difficult to retain composability of applications on different chains. What is composability? So composability is more of a vague term that can encompass many different things. It can encompass simple bridging of assets. The fact that you can move money easily from one chain to another is a form of composability. The ability for chains to trustlessly pass messages to each other, or to create a dependency between a transaction on one chain and events that are happening on another is another form of composability. If you can have cross-chain function calls, which is the way that applications on a single VM compose, we can actually have a transaction on one application call a function on an application on another. That is the highest form of composability that we have today. There could be other things on this list as well. When it comes to defining synchronous composability, I think a useful framework is just the traditional database systems concept of the ACID transactions. So if a user can express cross-chain transactions, such as their intent to atomically swap two assets on different chains, or something else, if they can do that in a way that retains atomicity, which means that all parts of the transaction complete or non-do, there's no in-between states or side effects, consistency of rules of multiple chains to preserve, isolation, that multiple cross-chain transactions or individual transactions on the different chains don't interfere with each other, and durability, the fact that there's consensus on a persistent global transaction log, and that holds across now all the different chains that are interacting, then you have synchronous composability. Now, durability and consistency are generally satisfied by any L2s sharing the common layer 1 protocol. The layer 1 protocol provides that, but it's atomistic in isolation that you don't necessarily ask for. How does the simplest form of message passing work for rollups? Deployed on top of the same layer 1? Well, it would work as follows. So rollups there are many different ways to implement this. They're all doing some form of this. So rollups have a mailbox, an inbox, and an outbox. They can write messages to their outbox, and because they're all settling to layer 1, there's some Merkle root of that mailbox that is stored on the layer 1. Now they can have a sequencer or just special transactions that populate their inbox and are verified against the Merkle root of the sending rollup. So in this case, after rollup A writes a bunch of transactions in some block to its outbox, then in the next block period, rollup B can read can verify a bunch of inbox messages against the outbox Merkle root of the first rollup. Now, for this to work, though, the rollup B cannot read these messages, cannot verify the correctness of these inbox messages until rollup A has settled. And for optimistic rollups, that could be several days. For ZK rollups, maybe several hours. Okay, so one thing that you can do once you have some form of cross-chain messaging that I would like to highlight is something called a shared L1 asset bridge, where it's essentially a third rollup that through which users would actually deposit all the assets, and it would maintain a table of which rollups these assets are stored on, right? So you wouldn't directly deposit ETH into rollup A or rollup B. You would deposit ETH into this shared liquidity bridge rollup that just holds a table of which rollups it's stored on. And now, if you have direct message passing between these rollups, which you can always do at high latency through the L1, then you can send messages between the rollups to just instruct this shared liquidity bridge to move assets from one rollup to the other. And because they're all deposited and withdrawn through this shared liquidity bridge, there's fungibility of these assets across all the different rollups. So that is a simple but powerful application that can be built on top of a cross-chain message passing. Now, of course, if the cross-chain message passing has to go through the L1 and settle through the L1, then this isn't that useful compared to just withdrawing to the L1 and depositing into the other rollup, right? So of course the goal is to make cross-chain messaging between rollups much better. So another way of characterizing the issue with cross-chain message passing through the L1 is that, well, not only do they have very high latency, but these cross-chain actions do not really have this asset property. There are side effects. So if you think about any of the bridging protocols today, or message passing protocols today, generally like an asset will remain locked for a long time on one chain during a swap until it receives some instruction or message or event notification about what happened on the other chain. And so this will interfere with other transactions because you can observe that this asset has remained locked for a long time. The other thing is that there's a liveness risk. If one of the chains loses liveness during an atomic swap, then that can actually break the atomicity of the cross-chain swap. So there's another way that we can do message passing between chains that would allow for the messages to be passed much more quickly, but still inheriting security from the layer 1. And it's a small tweak on what we were doing before, but this is how it would work. So instead of waiting for the Merkle root of the other chain to settle, you can allow the sequencer of the rollup to just pass in messages that it claims to be correct. And is sort of similar to the idea of optimistic rollups. At the time that the two rollups settle on the layer 1, you can implement some kind of consistency check between the vertical roots of the inboxes and outboxes to ensure that all the messages that were passed to one rollup indeed were written to the outbox of the other rollup. Okay, now, if we're doing it like this, we still don't achieve ACID cross-chain transactions, but this design allows us to move towards a design that will, which I'll present next. But let's look at this sort of design a little bit closer first. So notice that one of the things here is that if the sequencers are honest, then everything works really well, and you can pass messages between the rollups extremely quickly. But if the sequencers are dishonest, then you may end up in a scenario where you process a bunch of transactions, and then at the time that you settle to the layer 1, a while later, you realize that things were not correct, and you have to go back and start over. So dishonest sequencers could cause short-term reorgs. So ideally, you would have an additional mechanism that allows for the rollup operators of the chain, the full nodes of the chain, to detect when sequencers misbehave. Another thing that you can do for greater efficiency is, instead of implementing these cross-checks between the mailboxes on the layer 1, is if the rollups themselves are ZK rollups, then you can actually just aggregate proofs from the different rollups. If the rollups are optimistic rollups, then there are ways that this is sort of featured in the optimism sort of superchain interoperability design. There are ways of sort of integrating the fraud proof mechanisms into the different chains to also implement this in a kind of cross-check in a different way. So, why are ACID cross-chain transactions so hard? Well, essentially, one of the things that we need to do is we need to be able to emulate multiple rounds of communication between chains in a single block. So in order to truly achieve ACID cross-chain transactions, you need to have a chain send a message to another chain and then verify a response within the same block. Right? So that way we don't have a period where we have an observable side effect where something, for example, an ACID is locked for a long time while waiting for a response back. There's an inherent dependency also on the global ordering across all chains of individual chain transactions. And of course, we could naively build this. It's not hard to build this, but there's an efficiency requirement. If we just merge all the chains or rollups into one rollup, then that would certainly solve this in a trivial way. But obviously, we want to preserve the horizontal scaling and also the ability to have multiple diverse virtual machines and rollups. So one way to look at this is through the lens of collaborative snarks, at least for ZK rollups. You can think of a cross-chain transaction as taking place in some kind of unified virtual machine in which that encompasses all the states of the different rollups. And so you can frame the goal as creating a single ZK proof of the state transition for some distributed system of VMs with inter-process communication, where there's, say, one prover per VM, and the total work done per prover remains near constant. And so framing it in this way, there are actually generic solutions to this, because we have constructions of distributed snarks that allow exactly for this property. You can build that either based on snark recursion, or there are distributed snark protocols like distributed sum checks and distributed FFTs that can be used to do this. Now, that would change quite substantially sort of the operating model of rollups today, because we think of the rollup prover as responsible for transactions specifically in that rollup, not as participating in some distributed snark creation among all the different rollup provers out there. But I do want to point this out, someone's help to zoom out and think about the goals from a different angle and whether there are already just generic solutions that exist. And in this case, the answer is yes. Now, I'm going to present something that's much closer to the way that people are designing cross-chain communication today, such as in the optimism ecosystem and in the Polygon ecosystem. And it's a simple extension of the asynchronous mailbox design that I just presented. You can think of it as a special case of creating a distributed snark at least in the ZK case. But it is not powerful enough to capture all forms of synchronous composability. So it doesn't capture arbitrary function calls between applications of different chains, but it does cover at least all the use cases that I can think of, including flash loans and things like that. So a flash loan, for example, would work like this. Instead of having two different sequencers for the two different rollups that pass in messages to the inboxes once they've been written to the outbox of the other chain, you can have a coordinator that actually executes the two different chains logic, figures out what the messages sent between the chains should be, even over multiple rounds of messaging, and just provide the messages to the inboxes of each chain. So for example, let's say you have a transaction on Rollup A, it's going to borrow some funds, it's going to execute a bridge transaction, so it's going to burn the funds, it's going to write a message to its outbox that said some amount of money was burned. Meanwhile, a message is written by the coordinator who's constructing these two blocks at the same time. They're not actually sending messages between them, it's just the coordinators populating the inbox of the other rollup with a message that says, oh, X dollars were burned on rollup A. And meanwhile, transaction A continues executing. It's going to read a message from its inbox that tells it the result of what happened on the other side, that Y dollars were burned, and it's going to then mint funds and return the funds to the lender. Right? So it doesn't ever wait for a response, it just executes these transactions by writing to the outbox and reading from the inbox. On the other side, you're going to have a second transaction that mints funds based on the fact that X dollars were burned. It reads that from the inbox. It then writes to its outbox that it then tries to execute, say, multiple swaps at desired prices, maybe makes some profit, and then writes and then burns the funds and writes that message to its outbox. So the key thing here is that the two rollups are just verifying a transcript of communication. They're not actually sending messages and waiting for the response. Yeah. How many times?
We're out of time.
Okay, out of time. So anyways, then this is my final slide. So this idea is formalized in this short paper that we wrote, Coordinated Inter-Rollup Communication. You can think about it as a generalization and an abstraction of what is being done to a degree within the optimism superchain interoperability protocol, although they don't have the synchronous composability case, but it can be captured as a special case, and also what's being done in Polygon Aggregator. It doesn't require any modifications to the chains, it allows for parallel proving, and it's not fully general, but it covers the most practical use cases of synchronous composability. So, thank you.